Chapter 1. The Ghost of Silver Ridge. The icy wind bit into Seraphina's skin as she hauled the heavy iron wash bucket across the frozen courtyard of the Silver Ridge pack house. Every step felt like a penance, the slush seeping through her worn boots to numb her toes. Because she was the rejected one, the lowest of the low, no one offered a hand or even a glance. She kept her chin tucked into her chest, her gaze anchored to the gray stone beneath her feet. Safety lived in the shadows. Safety was being a ghost that everyone chose to forget. Ever since the public rejection, her life had become a series of invisible chores. She scrubbed the floors where her former mate walked with his new, pure companion, never once looking up to see the man who had crushed her soul in front of the entire pack. It was a strange, hollow existence. Her mother's death during her birth had planted a seed of guilt that she cost people their lives, and the ceremony had watered that seed until it bloomed into a suffocating forest of unworthiness. Why would anyone want a woman who brought only ruin and shadow? As she reached the back entrance of the kitchens, a group of high-ranking warriors sauntered past, their laughter like jagged glass in the quiet morning. One of them kicked a spray of dirty snow onto her skirt, but she didn't flinch. She just stood there, a statue of resignation. She had learned that reacting only fed their hunger for cruelty. If she stayed perfectly still, she became part of the architecture, a pillar of the pack that nobody thanked, but everyone used. "Did you hear the scouts?" one warrior whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. Seraphina froze, her fingers gripping the frozen handle of the bucket. "The rogues are moving at the border. They aren't looking for territory or meat this time. They're asking about her." The warrior jerked his thumb toward Seraphina's hunched form. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Why would the outcasts, the lawless wolves of the fringe, care about a nameless Omega? Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut because she knew that attention in this pack was a death sentence. She needed to disappear further into the periphery, to melt into the very walls until she was nothing but a memory. Moving with a sudden, frantic energy, she pushed through the kitchen doors. The heat of the ovens hit her face, but it brought no comfort. She could feel eyes on the back of her neck, not the eyes of the warriors, but something more ancient and predatory. Why did the air suddenly smell like ozone and burnt cedar? She emptied the water into the basin, her hands trembling so violently that the liquid splashed onto her apron. She was nobody. She had to be nobody. But as she turned to leave, she saw a shadow through the frosted window that didn't belong to any pack member, a silhouette that watched her with a terrifying singular focus. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Ascension. The scent of incense always made Seraphina's stomach turn because it carried the stench of her greatest failure. She closed her eyes for a second, and suddenly she was back on the elevated dais of the Ascension ceremony, the moon hanging full and judgmental above the peaks. Every member of Silver Ridge had been there, a sea of faces illuminated by torchlight. She had stood beside Jax, the man she thought was her destiny, her heart singing with the naive belief that she was finally being chosen. Then came the moment of the bond check, the instant where the Alpha Priest reached out to confirm the spiritual tether. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Jax hadn't just stepped away. He had recoiled as if she were a rotting carcass. He looked at her with a disgust so visceral it felt like a physical blow to her chest. "I reject this hollow shell," he had roared, his voice amplified by the mountain air. "I will not tie my bloodline to a curse." The memory burned like lye in her veins. She remembered the way her father had looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the daughter who had killed his mate and then shamed his house. Anger, a long-dormant ember, flickered deep in her chest before she smothered it with the heavy blanket of her shame. She had no right to be angry. The world had told her what she was, and she had simply failed to listen until it was too late. A sudden heavy thud at the door snapped her back to the present. The kitchen was empty now, the fires dying down to orange glimmers. She stood alone in the dim light, her breath hitching as the heavy oak door groaned on its hinges. The pack guards didn't knock. They invaded. 4 men in dark leather armor marched into the room, their faces set in grim masks of duty. They didn't see a woman. They saw a problem that needed to be solved. "Seraphina of the Silver Ridge," the lead guard barked, his voice echoing off the copper pots. "You are under arrest by order of the Alpha Council." She didn't move, her mind racing to understand. Arrest? She had done nothing but scrub and suffer. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice sounding thin and alien to her own ears. The guard stepped forward, grabbing her arm with a grip that would leave bruises by morning. "Treason. We have evidence of your communications with the rogue Lycans. You've been selling pack secrets to the very monsters who want us dead." A laugh, dry and bitter, escaped her lips. She couldn't even get the cook to give her an extra piece of bread, yet they believed she was a mastermind of espionage. It was a convenient lie, a way to finally prune the dead branch from the family tree. As they dragged her toward the dungeons, she saw Jack standing in the hallway. He watched her pass with an expression of cold indifference, his silence a final nail in her coffin. He wouldn't save her because she was already dead to him. The hook was set. The execution was scheduled for dawn. Chapter 3. The Shadow Alpha's Claim. The dungeon was a damp, lightless maw that smelled of old blood and despair. Seraphina sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the weeping wall. She wasn't crying because she had no tears left for a life that had been a tragedy from the start. The irony was almost poetic. She would die for a crime she didn't commit, executed by the people she had tried so hard to please. She wondered if her mother was waiting for her on the other side, or if she would be just as disappointed as everyone else. Dawn arrived not with a sunrise, but with the rattling of chains. They led her out to the execution square, a natural stone amphitheater where the pack gathered to watch justice be served. The air was crisp, the sky a bruised purple. She was forced to her knees in the center of the circle, the cold stone biting into her shins. The Alpha of Silver Ridge stood over her, his silver blade drawn and gleaming in the morning light. "Any last words, traitor?" he asked, his voice devoid of mercy. Seraphina raised her head, looking not at the blade, but at the horizon. "I hope you find the monster you're actually looking for," she whispered. The Alpha raised the sword, the metal whistling as it began its descent. Suddenly, the wind shifted. A scent so powerful it felt like a physical weight crashed over the assembly. Dark musk, ancient pine, and something that smelled like a thunderstorm. A roar ripped through the air, vibrating in the very marrow of Seraphina's bones. The sword stopped inches from her neck as a massive black wolf, larger than any shifter she had ever seen, vaulted over the perimeter wall. The wolf shifted in midair, landing on 2 feet with the grace of a god and the fury of a demon. This was Kael Draven, the Alpha of the Obsidian Peak, a man whose name was used to frighten children into obedience. He moved toward her, the pack guards falling back in a wave of instinctive terror. When he reached her, he didn't strike. He reached out a gloved hand and touched her cheek. The moment his skin met hers, a literal explosion of heat erupted. It wasn't a spark. It was a detonation. The mate bond, dormant and denied, roared to life with a violence that made her vision white out. It was a golden chain of fire linking her soul to his, a connection so visceral it felt like she was being rewritten from the inside out. Her breath left her in a ragged gasp. Kael turned his gaze to the Silver Ridge Alpha, his eyes glowing a lethal, predatory gold. He stepped in front of her, his massive frame shielding her from the entire pack. "This woman is no traitor," Kael growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the earth. "She is the heartbeat of the Obsidian Peak. She belongs to me, and if any of you lay a finger on her again, I will burn this mountain to ash." Seraphina looked up at the man who had just saved her, her mind reeling. He had chosen her. He had claimed the rejected one. But as she felt the raw, terrifying power radiating from him, a new fear took root. She was a ruin. She was poison. And as she looked into the eyes of the Shadow Alpha, she realized that by saving her, he might have just invited his own destruction. Would she be the one to finally break the man who had dared to choose the unchoosable? Kael didn't wait for an answer. He scooped her up into his arms, his touch a brand of fire against her skin. "We're leaving," he murmured against her ear. "Your life as a ghost is over." As he carried her away from the stunned pack, Seraphina felt a strange sensation in her blood. A humming, a waking power that felt entirely too large for her body. The rogues were still out there, the secrets of her blood were still hidden, and the bond was a wild thing that threatened to consume them both. The story had just begun, and the path ahead was paved with fire. Chapter 4. The Fortress of Obsidian. The transition from the frozen misery of Silver Ridge to the black volcanic peaks of Kael's territory happened in a blur of wind and predatory heat. Kael carried her across the threshold of his fortress, as if she were made of spun glass, yet his grip remained unyielding. Because his touch acted as a conduit for the bond, Seraphina felt every muscle in his chest vibrating against her shoulder. She was a captive of his strength, tucked into the crook of an arm that could easily crush a man's throat. Every breath he took smelled like cedar and ancient stone, a scent that began to overwrite the lingering stench of her dungeon cell. He set her down in a hall carved directly into the mountain, where the walls wept with heat rather than ice. The architecture here was brutal and honest, lacking the gilded pretension of her former home. Huge hearths roared with orange flames, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to bow as Kael passed. He didn't look at the servants who hurried to bring furs and wine. His eyes remained fixed on Seraphina, tracking the pulse in her neck with terrifying intensity. She felt like a small creature caught in the gaze of a wolf that hadn't eaten in years. "This is the trial bonding," Kael announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted stone. He turned to his advisors, who watched from the balcony with wary expressions. "She remains under my protection. No one approaches her without my leave. If she wishes to run, she stays within the wards. If she wishes to fight, she fights me." Seraphina wrapped her arms around her middle, the heat of the room doing little to thaw the internal ice of her trauma. She knew how this story ended. A powerful man saw a broken thing and thought he could fix it, only to realize the cracks were too deep. Fate had played a cruel joke by tethering her to the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories. She expected the rejection to come by nightfall, once the initial rush of the bond faded, and he saw the hollow girl beneath the soot. "You're waiting for the blow," Kael murmured, stepping into her personal space until the air between them shimmered. "You're bracing for me to turn my back." She looked up, her jaw tightening with defensive hostility. "I've seen how quickly a choice can be revoked, Alpha. You claimed me to save face in front of a rival, but we both know I'm a liability. Just tell me where the servants' quarters are so I can start earning my keep." Kael leaned down, his face inches from hers, his golden eyes burning with a localized sun. "You aren't a servant here, Seraphina. You are the reason this mountain is screaming." He grabbed her hand and pressed it against his chest, right over his thundering heart. Under her skin, she felt a sudden violent throb, a surge of something dark and electric that didn't belong to a normal wolf. It felt like a slumbering beast was stretching its claws within her marrow. Something was awakening, and the sheer pressure of it made the stone floor beneath them groan. Chapter 5. The Friction of Souls. The obsidian halls felt like a labyrinth designed to keep Seraphina trapped within Kael's gravity. For 3 days, she had avoided the communal areas, yet Kael was everywhere. A shadow at the end of the corridor, a heavy footfall outside her door, a constant psychic hum at the edge of her mind. Because she was determined to remain unattached, she met his every kindness with a barbed remark. She refused the silk gowns he sent, choosing instead to wear a simple tunic that made her look like the commoner she believed herself to be. "You're hiding in plain sight again," Kael's voice rumbled from the doorway of the library. He stepped inside, the sheer mass of him making the room feel suddenly cramped. "My pack is starting to think I've brought a ghost into the house." Seraphina didn't look up from the ancient map she was pretending to study. "A ghost is easier to manage than a woman who shouldn't exist. Why are you doing this, Kael? You have scars that tell stories of a dead mate and a lost war. You don't need a rejected Omega with a treason charge hanging over her head. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, his hand slamming onto the table to spin her chair around. The proximity was electric, a physical assault on her senses. I don't choose things because they are easy. I choose them because they are mine. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, the anger between them transformed into a thick, suffocating tension. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone. Seraphina felt her resolve crumbling like dry earth. She hated that he saw through her, hated that his presence made her feel seen instead of watched. She surged upward, intending to push him away, but her hands landed on the hard planes of his chest. Her fingers curled into his shirt, and for a second she almost leaned in. She wanted to taste the fire he offered. She wanted to lose herself in the violence of his need. "Touch me," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged plea. "Show me the ruin you think you are." She jerked back as if burned, her heart racing. The heat under her skin spiked, a flash of white-hot energy dancing across her knuckles. It wasn't just attraction. It was a warning. A rival Alpha's messenger had arrived at the gates an hour ago, demanding her custody in the name of the High Council. The political walls were closing in, and the bond was a fuse that had already been lit. She couldn't afford to love him, because love was the weapon that would eventually be used to slit his throat. Chapter 6. The Boundary of Blood. The arrival of the rival Alpha's envoy turned the tension in the fortress from a simmer to a boil. Lord Varric of the Iron Fang Pack stood in the center of the Great Hall, his eyes narrowed as he watched Seraphina enter at Kael's side. The air in the room was thick with the scent of wet fur and aggression. Because Kael refused to release her hand, the bond pulsed between them like a second heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of the claim he had made before the gods. "The girl is a fugitive of the Silver Ridge," Varric stated, his voice like grinding gravel. "By the laws of the Lycan Accord, she must be returned for questioning. You are harboring a traitor, Draven. Is one broken woman worth a war between our borders?" Kael's grip on Seraphina's hand tightened, his knuckles turning white. "She is not a girl, and she is certainly not yours to question. If the council wants her, they can come and take her from the center of my pyre." The room erupted in low growls. Seraphina felt the eyes of Kael's own warriors on her, some with curiosity, others with blatant resentment. They saw her as the spark that would ignite their homes. She wanted to step forward to tell them she would go and spare them the bloodshed, but the power in her blood wouldn't let her. It felt like a coiled serpent was rising in her throat, demanding that she stand her ground. She wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a catalyst. "She has the blood of the ancients in her," Varric sneered, stepping closer. "Can't you smell it? It's sour. It's the scent of a lineage that was supposed to be extinct. You're guarding a monster, Kael. One day she'll wake up and she'll take everything you've built." Kael didn't flinch. He stepped in front of Seraphina, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Then I will be the one she destroys. But until that day comes, you will leave my mountain." Varric spat on the floor and turned to leave, but the threat hung in the air like a poisonous mist. As the heavy doors slammed shut, Kael turned to Seraphina. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deepening in the torchlight. For the first time, she saw the weight of the crown he wore. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the jagged scar that ran along his collarbone, a remnant of the battle where he lost his first mate. "Why?" she whispered, the word breaking against the silence of the hall. "Why risk everything for someone who doesn't even believe in herself?" Kael took a step toward her, his forehead resting against hers. "Because for the first time in 100 years, the mountain isn't the only thing that's alive. You aren't poison, Seraphina. You're the cure." He pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe him. But deep in her marrow, the heat continued to grow, a silent, ticking clock that threatened to blow the world apart. The rogues were moving, the council was watching, and the girl who once prayed to be invisible was about to become the sun. Chapter 7. The Whispering Gallery. The weight of the Obsidian Pack's collective gaze felt like a physical burden on Seraphina's shoulders as she moved through the communal dining hall. Because she had spent years training herself to be invisible, every curious stare and muffled whisper felt like a needle pricking her skin. She walked with her head slightly bowed, but her eyes remained sharp, darting between the warriors who watched her with suspicion, and the Omegas who looked at her with a mix of pity and awe. They didn't see a woman, they saw a ticking clock that threatened their peace. "Is that her?" a voice hissed from behind a stack of crates. "The one who caused the execution to fail? She looks like she'd break if the wind blew too hard." Seraphina's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles ached. She wanted to tell them that she had survived things that would make their nightmares seem like lullabies, but the defensive wall she had built around her heart remained impenetrable. She moved to the far end of the hall, hoping to find a corner where the shadows were deep enough to hide in. However, the mountain didn't seem to want her to hide anymore. The very air around her felt charged, a static hum that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. As she reached for a pitcher of water, a hand slammed onto the table beside hers. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a high-ranking female warrior, her face scarred and her eyes narrowed in a cold, analytical sweep. "You're the reason our borders are being tested," the woman stated, her voice a low snarl. "If Kael dies because he's protecting a broken bird from Silver Ridge, I'll be the one to make sure you follow him to the grave." The threat hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Seraphina didn't look away, even though her instincts screamed at her to flee. She was tired of running from the judgment of others. Before she could find the words to respond, a heavy, authoritative presence filled the room. Kael moved through the hall like a storm front, his golden eyes locked on the warrior who stood over Seraphina. "Step back, Jada," Kael commanded, his voice vibrating with a dangerous edge. He didn't raise his voice, but the entire hall fell into a deathly silence. Because he was their alpha, they obeyed the command of his blood before their own thoughts. He walked to Seraphina's side and draped an arm over her shoulders, a public declaration of his protection. "This woman is your Luna in every way that matters. If you have a grievance with her, you bring it to me. If you threaten her again, you leave this mountain in pieces." Seraphina felt the warmth of him seep through her clothes, a stark contrast to the icy reception of the pack. She looked up at him, her heart aching with a confusing mix of gratitude and terror. He was defending her, but every public defense was another reason for her to fear the inevitable fall. As he led her out of the hall, she could still feel the heat of Jada's gaze burning into her back. The hook was set, the pack was divided, and she was the fracture point. Chapter 8. The Crucible of the Soul. The training grounds were a jagged shelf of rock overlooking the valley, the air thin and biting. Kael stood in the center of the ring, his shirt discarded despite the cold, his skin glistening with a light sheen of sweat. Because he understood that her fear was rooted in a lack of control, he had brought her here to teach her how to weaponize her own survival. Seraphina stood opposite him, her hands raised in a shaky, defensive posture. "Don't think about the bond," Kael instructed, his voice low and grounding. "Think about the ground beneath your feet. Feel the heat of the mountain. It's not just stone, Seraphina. It's alive, just like you." She lunged at him, but he caught her wrist with effortless grace, spinning her around until her back was pressed against his chest. The contact was a physical assault on her senses, the bond singing a frantic, high-pitched note in her blood. She struggled against him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can't do this, Kael. I'm not a warrior. I'm the girl who ruins things." Kael didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You're the girl who survived. Look at me." He turned her around, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability in his own gaze. He grabbed her hand and pressed it against the jagged, puckered scar on his collarbone. The heat between them spiked violently, a flash of red light dancing behind her eyelids. She felt his grief then, a cold, hollow ache that had lived in his chest since his first mate died. He hadn't just lost a partner, he had lost his way. "I chose power once," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence of the peaks. "I thought being the strongest meant I could keep the world out. I was wrong. I let her go to save a border, and I've been a ghost ever since." Seraphina's fingers traced the edge of the scar, her own heart swelling with a sudden, fierce empathy. They were both broken, two jagged pieces of glass trying to form a mirror. The attraction between them wasn't just physical. It was a desperate, soulful recognition. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The wind died down, and the only sound was the synchronized thud of their hearts. Suddenly, a horn blast shattered the moment. It was the low, mournful sound of the border alarm. Kael's expression hardened instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of alpha authority. He looked toward the tree line where the shadows were moving too fast to be deer. "Rogues," he growled, his hand flying to the hilt of his blade. "They're not just raiding, they're looking for you." Chapter 9. The Scent of Iron and Ash. The smell of ozone and wet earth filled the air as the first wave of rogues broke through the perimeter wards. These weren't the starving outcasts Seraphina remembered. They were organized, their eyes glowing with a frenzied, artificial light. Because they were targeting her specifically, they ignored the warriors on the flank and surged toward the training heights. Kael pushed Seraphina toward the stone keep, his wolf already beginning to surface beneath his skin. "Get inside!" he roared, his voice transitioning into a guttural snarl. "Lock the doors and don't come out until the air is clear." Seraphina ran, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the sounds of battle behind her, the wet thud of impacts, the screams of the wounded, and the terrifying primal howls of the shifters. She reached the heavy iron doors of the keep, but she stopped with her hand on the latch. A sudden, sharp realization pierced through her fear. If she hid, Kael would die protecting her. If she ran, she would always be the girl who cost people their lives. She turned back to see Kael surrounded by 4 massive rogues. He was a whirlwind of black fur and claws, but he was outnumbered. One of the rogues, a scarred brute with a jagged ear, lunged for Kael's throat while his back was turned. "No!" Seraphina screamed, the word tearing out of her throat with a force that felt like physical fire. A shockwave of energy erupted from her chest, a blinding pulse of silver-white light that knocked the rogues backward. The ground beneath her feet cracked, a fissure of heat snaking out toward the attackers. She stood in the center of the clearing, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes glowing with a light that didn't belong to any wolf. She felt powerful. She felt terrifying. And for the first time, she felt the truth of Varric's warning. The rogues retreated into the shadows, their mission thwarted by the sudden display of power. Kael shifted back, his chest heaving, his body covered in shallow cuts and grime. He walked toward her, his expression a mix of awe and profound fear. He didn't reach for her this time. He stopped a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the glowing energy still dancing across her fingertips. "They want what's inside you," Kael whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "They don't want a Luna, Seraphina. They want a weapon." The silence that followed was heavier than any battle. Seraphina looked at her hands, the silver light fading into the gray morning. She had saved him, but the cost was the one thing she had fought to keep secret. She wasn't just a rejected Omega. She was something ancient, something that could tip the balance of the entire world, or burn it to the ground. The question wasn't whether she was worthy of being chosen. It was whether Kael could survive the choice. Chapter 10. The Sealed Lineage. The air in the subterranean archives was thick with the scent of moldy parchment and ancient dust. Kael led Seraphina deep beneath the mountain, past the armories and the grain stores, to a room that hadn't been opened in a generation. Because the secrets of the lichen blood were too dangerous for the surface, they had been buried in the dark. Kael held a torch high, the light flickering over rows of stone tablets and leather-bound journals. He was looking for a specific mark, a sigil that mirrored the strange, swirling pattern that had appeared on Seraphina's skin during the attack. "My father spoke of a bloodline that was sealed away because it was too volatile," Kael murmured, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "They were the Lycan ancients, wolves who didn't just shift, but commanded the very essence of the moon. They weren't leaders. They were forces of nature." Seraphina followed him, her fingers tracing the rough stone of the shelves. She felt a strange pull toward a heavy, black-bound book at the end of the hall. When she touched the cover, a jolt of recognition raced up her arm, making her breath hitch. She opened it to find a drawing of a woman surrounded by the same silver-white light she had unleashed on the training grounds. The text was written in a language that felt like a song she had forgotten the words to. It says, "The power is a gift of the moon, but it comes with a price," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The soul of the ancient is a fire that consumes everything it touches. To fully awaken, the wolf must bond, but the surge of energy during the final mating is often fatal to the partner." Horror, cold and absolute, washed over her. She looked at Kael, who was watching her with an expression of grim realization. Because she loved him, a truth she was finally forced to admit, the knowledge felt like a serrated blade in her gut. She wasn't just a woman who brought bad luck. She was a literal death sentence for the man who had saved her. Her mother hadn't just died giving birth to her. She had died because she couldn't contain the power she was passing on. "We have to stop this," Seraphina said, stepping back from him. "The bond, the trial mating, it's a trap. If I stay with you, if I let myself belong to you, I will kill you, Kael. The energy will tear your heart apart." Kael didn't move away. He stepped closer, his jaw set in a line of stubborn defiance. "I've spent my life fighting wars I didn't start, Seraphina. I'm not going to run from a prophecy written by men who were afraid of their own shadows." He reached for her, but she flinched, the guilt of her existence finally reaching a breaking point. The hook was no longer the rogues at the gate. It was the ticking bomb inside her own chest. Chapter 11. The Surge of Destruction. The midday sun was a pale, heatless disk as Seraphina stood in the center of the courtyard, trying to follow Kael's instructions on how to ground her energy. She felt like a vessel filled with boiling oil, every nerve ending screaming with the pressure of the sealed power. Because she was terrified of hurting him, her movements were stiff and mechanical. Kael stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching her with a mixture of concern and a strange, desperate hope. "Don't fight the current, Seraphina," Kael urged, his voice low and steady. "Let it flow through you like a river. If you try to dam it up, the walls will burst." She closed her eyes, trying to find the center of the storm. She thought of the way Kael had looked at her in the hall, the way his touch made her feel like she was more than a mistake. For a second, she felt a sense of peace, a shimmering thread of silver light winding around her fingers. But then a sudden intrusive thought of her mother's dying face flashed through her mind. The peace shattered. The silver thread turned into a jagged bolt of lightning. A violent surge of energy erupted from her palms, far stronger than the one she had used against the rogues. It hit the stone floor with the force of a battering ram, sending shards of obsidian flying in every direction. Kael dived for cover, but a stray bolt of energy caught him in the shoulder, throwing him backward into a stone pillar. The sound of the impact made Seraphina's blood run cold. "Kael!" she screamed, the light finally fading from her eyes. She ran to him, her hands shaking as she reached for his slumped form. He was conscious, but a jagged burn mark was etched into his skin, and his breathing was shallow and pained. The sight of his injury confirmed her worst fear. She was a monster. Her core belief, the trauma that had defined her since childhood, had been proven true in the most visceral way possible. "I destroy the ones who choose me." Kael reached up, his fingers brushing her cheek even as he winced in pain. It's okay," he wheezed. It was an accident. No, she whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. It's what I am. She pulled away from him, her heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She couldn't stay. She couldn't watch him die because of her. As the pack healers rushed toward them, Seraphina began to plan her escape. She would leave him to save him, even if it meant becoming a ghost in the wilderness. Chapter 12. The Grief of Kings. The shadows in Kael's private study were long and mournful as he sat by the fire, his shoulder wrapped in bandages that smelled of bitter herbs. Seraphina stood by the window, her back to him, watching the snow fall over the jagged peaks. The silence between them was a heavy, suffocating thing. Because she had already decided to leave, every word felt like a final goodbye. I lost my first mate because I was a coward, Kael said suddenly, his voice cracking the stillness. Seraphina turned, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the flames. I knew the border was under attack, but I chose to lead the charge myself instead of staying with her. I wanted the glory of the kill more than I wanted the quiet of her company. She died alone because I chose power over love. He looked up then, his golden eyes swimming with a grief that went back decades. I see the same fear in you, Seraphina. You think your power is a curse, but the real curse is being afraid of what we could be together. We're both survivors of our own mistakes. Seraphina felt a surge of shared grief, a profound connection that went deeper than the mate bond. They were both haunted by the ghosts of their pasts, two people trying to build a future on a foundation of ash. She walked toward him, her hand hovering over his uninjured shoulder. But Kael, my mistake is alive. It's in my blood. I can't just ignore the fact that I almost killed you today. Then we learn together, he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her down to sit beside him. We find a way to balance the fire. Before she could respond, the heavy alarm bell of the keep began to toll, a frantic, rhythmic sound that meant the inner sanctum had been breached. The doors to the study burst open, but it wasn't pack warriors who entered. A group of lichen rogues, their eyes glowing with a terrifying, unnatural violet light, flooded into the room. They didn't move like animals. They moved like soldiers. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with silver hair and a crown of scars. The alpha of the Obsidian Peak has lived long enough, he sneered, and the weapon has finally ripened. Kael tried to stand, but the injury from Seraphina's surge made him stumble. Before he could shift, the rogue leader threw a glass vial at the floor, releasing a cloud of acrid purple gas that paralyzed their lungs. Seraphina felt her knees buckle as the world began to spin. She saw the rogues grab Kael, and she saw them coming for her. As the darkness claimed her, the last thing she felt was a cold hand gripping her arm and a voice whispering, "Your mother couldn't save you, and neither can he." Chapter 13. The Altar of the Ancients. The cold was the first thing to return, a biting, unnatural chill that seeped into Seraphina's bones. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she wasn't in the warm, cedar-scented halls of the Obsidian Peak. Instead, she was shackled to a jagged stone monolith in the center of a cavern that breathed with the stench of stagnant water and old copper. Because the shackles were lined with silver, every movement sent a searing jolt of pain through her wrists, suppressing her wolf and making her feel dangerously human. In the center of the chamber stood the silver-haired rogue leader, his violet eyes reflecting the glow of a dozen torches. He watched her with a clinical, detached curiosity that made her skin crawl. Around him, other rogues moved in a rhythmic, chanting circle, their voices low and guttural. They weren't just outcasts. They were cultists of a forgotten age, and she was the center of their ritual. "You possess a treasure you don't even understand," the leader said, his voice echoing off the damp ceiling. The blood of the lichen ancients was never meant to be hidden in a kitchen or suppressed by a weak alpha's love. It was meant to be harvested. Seraphina pulled against the chains, the silver burning her skin like branding irons. "Where is Kael?" she rasped, her throat feeling like it was filled with glass. "If you've hurt him," I'll burn this cave to the ground. The leader laughed, a dry sound that carried no warmth. Your alpha is currently busy dying in the ruins of his own pride. He stormed our perimeter alone, thinking his rage could overcome our wards. He's a relic of a dying era, Seraphina. You, however, are the future. He stepped closer, holding a jagged obsidian dagger. Your mother was a coward. She sealed your power because she was afraid of the change it would bring to the world. We are going to unseal it. Rage, cold and sharp, began to replace the fear in her chest. She had spent her whole life being told she was a mistake, a ruin, a thing to be hidden. But as she looked at the man who had stolen her from her home, she realized she was tired of being the victim of other people's expectations. If she was a weapon, then it was time she learned how to aim. She stopped pulling against the silver and closed her eyes, searching for that boiling current in her blood. She didn't try to ground it this time. She reached for it with both hands. Chapter 14. The Breaking of the Seal. The first cut of the obsidian dagger was shallow, drawn across Seraphina's forearm, but it acted like a key in a lock. The ritual chanters increased their volume, their voices rising to a fever pitch that vibrated in the very stone beneath her feet. Because the silver shackles were still suppressing her physical shift, the power had nowhere to go but inward. It built behind her ribs, a pressure so immense she felt her heart might stop. "Let it out," the leader commanded, his face twisted in a mask of fanatical joy. "Accept your birthright." Suddenly, the cavern entrance exploded in a shower of stone and dust. Kael Draven charged into the room, his black fur matted with blood, his golden eyes burning with a murderous light. He was a vision of primal fury, tearing through the outer circle of rogues with a speed that defied the laws of physics. However, he was limping, the injuries from the previous attack and the guards at the gate taking their toll. "Kael, no!" Seraphina screamed. Seeing him wounded again because of her was the final fracture in her psyche. The guilt and the love collided in her chest, and the seal her mother had placed on her soul finally shattered. The silver shackles didn't just break, they vaporized. A pillar of white-hot lunar energy erupted from Seraphina, hitting the ceiling with the force of a falling star. The shockwave threw the rogue leader against the wall and sent the torches spinning into the darkness. She stood in the center of the ruin, her hair glowing like filament, her skin shimmering with an ethereal light. She felt the bond to Kael fraying, the sheer intensity of her power acting like an acid on the spiritual tether. It was too much. She was a sun trapped in a human shell, and the heat was beginning to cook her from the inside out. She saw Kael reaching for her, his face a mask of agony as the proximity to her unsealed power began to blister his skin. "Stay back!" she cried, her voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping tones. She lunged at the rogue leader, her movements a blur of light. She didn't need a weapon, her hands were the weapon. When she struck him, the energy didn't just wound, it erased. But with every blow, she felt herself slipping further away from the woman she had been. She was losing her humanity to the ancient fire. She looked at Kael, who was struggling to stand, and realized with a sickening horror that if she stayed in this state, the next surge would kill him instantly. Chapter 15. The Fracture of the Heart. The battle in the cavern was a whirlwind of violence and light, but the real war was happening inside Seraphina's soul. The power was a hungry thing, demanding total surrender, and it was using her love for Kael as fuel. Because the bond was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth, the ancient energy was trying to snap it. She felt the golden thread between them stretching, thinning, and beginning to crack. "Kael, run," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He didn't run. He dragged himself toward her, his hand reaching out through the shimmering heat haze of her aura. "I'm not leaving you," he choked out, the skin on his arm reddening from the sheer intensity of the light she was emitting. "I chose you, Seraphina, all of you." The moment his fingers touched her hand, the bond destabilized completely. It wasn't an explosion. It was a groan of metaphysical weight. Seraphina felt a sharp, agonizing pull in her chest, like a limb being torn from its socket. The golden thread turned black and then gray. The connection that had saved her life and given her a purpose was disintegrating under the pressure of her own blood. She saw the light die out of Kael's eyes as the bond fractured. He collapsed to the floor, his breathing stopping for a terrifying, eternal second. The silence that followed was absolute. The rogues were dead or fled. The cavern was a tomb of smoke, and the man she loved was a broken heap at her feet. She had done it. She had finally achieved what she always feared she would. She had destroyed the one who chose her. She knelt beside him, the silver light fading into a dull, ashen glow. She reached for the bond, but there was nothing there, only a cold, echoing void where his heartbeat used to be. There was no turning back. The seal was gone, her power was awake, and the bridge between them was a ruin. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had just unleashed a god, and felt nothing but the crushing weight of her own toxicity. She had saved him from the rogues only to kill him with her soul. Chapter 16. The Hollow Throne. The silence in the cavern was a physical weight, a tomb-like stillness that pressed against Seraphina's eardrums until they throbbed. She knelt over Kael's motionless body, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against the cold hollow of his throat. Because the bond had fractured, she could no longer feel the rhythmic pull of his soul, that steady drumbeat that had become her only compass. Her power, now a dull and heavy ache in her marrow, flickered like a dying candle. She had won the battle, but as she looked at the man she had scorched with her very existence, victory tasted like ash and iron. "Kael, please," she whispered, her voice cracking in the damp air. "Don't leave me in the dark." He didn't move. His skin was pale, the vibrant gold of his eyes hidden behind closed lids. The trauma of her life, the belief that she was a vessel of ruin, had finally reached its zenith. She wasn't just a rejected Omega or a girl who cost her mother's life. She was the architect of this specific, agonizing silence. She gathered him into her arms, pulling his heavy head to her chest, wishing she could pour her own life force back into him. But she was empty. The ancient fire had burned through everything, leaving nothing but the charred remains of a woman who dared to hope. Suddenly, a ragged, wet gasp broke the silence. Kael's chest lurched, his body bucking as his lungs fought to pull in the smoke-filled air. His eyes flew open, but they weren't golden. They were a flat, lifeless gray. He looked at her, but there was no recognition, no warmth, no tether. The bond hadn't just snapped. It had left a scar on the world itself. He was alive, but the man who had claimed her was gone, replaced by a hollow king who didn't know his queen. "Who are you?" he wheezed, his hand falling limp from her shoulder. The question was a serrated blade across her heart. Because she believed she had killed his spirit, she didn't even try to explain. She just sat there in the ruins, holding the shell of the man she loved, knowing that her presence was the very thing that had hollowed him out. She had become the poison she always feared she was, and the world was finally quiet enough for her to hear her own soul breaking. Chapter 17. The Weaver of Lies. The return to the Obsidian Peak was a funeral procession without a coffin. Kael was carried on a litter, his warriors silent and grim, their eyes averted whenever Seraphina passed. They knew. Even without the bond, the pack could sense the void where their alpha's strength used to be. Because she was the cause of the fracture, she walked at the very rear, a ghost following a ghost. When they reached the fortress, she was steered toward the lower levels, not by force, but by a collective, unspoken shunning. In the dim light of the library, a figure waited for her. It was the rogue leader's second-in-command, a man named Silas who had surrendered when the light hit the cave. He sat among the scrolls, his expression one of twisted pity. "You think you're a monster," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You think you're the reason he's broken." Seraphina stopped, her hand hovering over a shelf of dusty books. "I saw the light hit him, Silas. I felt the bond snap under the weight of my blood. Don't tell me what I am. I've known it since the day I was born. Silas stood, pulling a small weathered journal from his vest. Your mother didn't seal your power to protect the world from you, Seraphina. She sealed it to protect you from the alphas. She knew that men like Kael, and men like the ones who raised you, would only ever see you as a battery or a blade. The power doesn't destroy the one you love, it destroys the one who tries to own it. He tossed the journal onto the table. It was her mother's handwriting, frantic and elegant. As Seraphina read the words, the world began to tilt. Her mother hadn't died because Seraphina was toxic. She had died because she had tried to hold back the very power that could have saved her, fearing it would make her a target. The ruin wasn't the power itself, it was the fear of it. Seraphina's core flaw was exposed. She had confused her strength with destruction because she had been taught to view herself through the eyes of those who feared her. The bond didn't snap because you're poison, Silas whispered. It snapped because you believed you were. You rejected yourself before the power could ever choose a side. Chapter 18. The choice of the void night fell over the mountain like a heavy velvet curtain, and Seraphina stood on the balcony overlooking the training grounds. Below, she could see the flickering torches of the guard, a constant reminder of the war that was still coming. Kael was awake now, sitting in his study, staring at the walls with a vacant intensity. He was a king without a crown, a wolf without a pack, and it was all because of the golden thread she had let go of in the dark. She looked at the obsidian dagger she had taken from the cavern, its edge glinting in the moonlight. She could end it here. She could sever the last frayed edges of the connection, freeing Kael from the shadow of her existence and letting the ancient power fade back into the stone. It would be the ultimate act of self-protection. She would leave before she could be left again, just as she always had. I can't do this, she whispered to the wind, the blade cold against her palm. I can't watch him look at me and see a stranger. But as she raised the dagger, a memory surfaced, not of the rejection, not of the execution, but of the way Kael had looked at her when he said, I choose you, not fate. He hadn't asked for a weapon or a Luna. He had asked for her. And she realized that by running away now, she would be making the same choice her mother had made. She would be letting fear win. She dropped the dagger, the metal clattering against the stone floor. She didn't want to be a ghost anymore. She didn't want to be the woman who ruins things. If the bond was broken, then she would have to build something new in its place, something that didn't rely on fate or blood, but on the terrifying, beautiful simplicity of a choice. She turned away from the edge of the balcony and began to walk toward the Alpha's quarters. The hallway was empty, the air thick with the scent of cedar and old grief. She reached the heavy oak doors and paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. Because she was terrified of the silence that waited on the other side, she almost turned back. But then she felt a small, steady spark in her chest, not the roar of the ancient fire, but the quiet heat of her own resolve. She pushed the doors open. Kael was there, sitting in the darkness, but as she entered, he turned his head. For the first time since the cavern, a flicker of something, a shadow of a memory, passed through his gray eyes. Chapter 19. The Altar of Choice. The darkness in Kael's chambers was thick enough to swallow the light of the dying embers in the hearth. Seraphina stood by the door, her breath hitched in her throat, watching the silhouette of the man who had once been her entire world. Because the psychic tether was gone, the room felt cavernous and cold, lacking the vibrant hum of their shared energy. Kael didn't rise to greet her. He didn't even growl. He simply sat with his head bowed, a fallen god in a kingdom of shadows. I remember the smell of pine, Kael said, his voice a ghost of its former resonance. I remember a girl in a white dress standing on a platform, and I remember wanting to kill every man who looked at her with anything less than worship. But I don't know why. Seraphina crossed the room, her footsteps heavy on the stone. She didn't hide her glow this time. A soft, steady silver light emanated from her skin, illuminating the hollows of his face. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. You don't remember because the bond was a bridge, Kael. When I let the fear take over, I blew that bridge up. I thought I was saving you from the fire, but I only succeeded in leaving us both stranded. Kael looked up, and for a fleeting second, his gray eyes caught the silver of her aura. He stood up, his height still imposing even in his fractured state. He didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he leaned down until their foreheads pressed together, a mimicry of their old intimacy that sent a pang of grief through her heart. Then build a new one, Kael whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, fierce clarity. I don't care about the strings the moon tied between us. I don't care about the blood of your ancestors. I am standing here, Seraphina. I am looking at you, and I choose you, right now. Not because fate told me to, but because I want the woman who was brave enough to come back into this room. Hope, a sensation more terrifying than any rage, broke through the armor of her fear. She realized then that the bond hadn't been a gift. It had been a crutch. To truly love him, she had to stop relying on the magic to do the work. She squeezed his hand, her own power stabilizing, the silver light turning from a jagged flame into a warm, constant sun. She wasn't poison. She was the person he chose when he had nothing else left to give. Chapter 20. The War Council of the Broken. The Great Hall was a theater of tension as the sun rose over the Obsidian Peak. Seraphina stood at the head of the table, flanked by Kael and the few warriors who hadn't yet lost faith. Because the rogue faction was marching toward the gates, emboldened by the rumors of the Alpha's collapse, there was no time for a slow recovery. They had to act now, or the mountain would become a pyre for everyone inside. They think we're vulnerable because the bond is quiet, Seraphina stated, her voice ringing with a new, steel-edged authority. She traced the map on the table, her finger lingering over the narrow pass where the rogues would have to funnel their forces. They expect Kael to be a shell and me to be a weapon they can reclaim. We're going to use that arrogance against them. Kael stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He was still pale, and his movements lacked the predatory grace of his wolf, but the fire in his eyes had returned. He looked at his warriors, many of whom were shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. You've followed me because of my blood, Kael roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Now follow me because of our home. We are not just a pack of shifters, we are the Obsidian Peak, and we do not bow to outcasts who play with forbidden toys. The room erupted in a unified shout, the first spark of morale returning to the fortress. Seraphina felt a surge of pride, a sense of partnership that replaced the old, lopsided dynamic of protector and protected. They weren't just a mate and his omega anymore. They were a unified front. She saw Jada, the warrior who had threatened her in the dining hall, nodding slowly in respect. The fracture in the pack was beginning to knit together, not through magic, but through shared resolve. We move at sunset, Seraphina commanded, her gaze meeting Kael's. There was no psychic hum, no telepathic whisper, but the look they shared was more profound than any bond. It was a silent promise. They were going into the jaw of the beast together, and for the first time in her life, Seraphina wasn't worried about whether she would ruin him. She was only worried about making sure they both came back. Chapter 21. The eve of the eclipse. The air on the battlements was frigid, the scent of impending snow mixing with the metallic tang of sharpening blades. Seraphina stood alone for a moment, watching the horizon where the rogue campfires dotted the valley like malevolent stars. She felt the ancient power humming in her blood, but it no longer felt like a caged animal. Because she had accepted the choice to stay, the energy had found a place to settle, a purpose beyond destruction. Kael joined her, his presence a warm anchor against the biting wind. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. The silence was comfortable, a shared breath before the scream of battle. Are you afraid? Kael asked, his voice low. Seraphina turned to him, the moonlight catching the silver in her eyes. I'm terrified, Kael. Not of the rogues, but of what happens if I lose control again. What if the fire is too much? Kael took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. Then I'll be the one to pull you back. We aren't doing this for a prophecy, Seraphina. We're doing this so we can have a tomorrow where we don't have to talk about bloodlines or treason. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was soft, desperate, and entirely human. It was a seal of their own making. I'm ready, she whispered against his mouth. She pulled away and looked out at the valley. The time for hiding was over. The girl who scrubbed floors in Silver Ridge was dead, and the weapon the rogues wanted to harvest didn't exist. There was only Seraphina, the woman who had chosen to love a king in the dark. She stepped forward toward the stairs, her hand finding Kael's in the gloom. The final push was beginning, and as she looked at the mountain she had come to call home, she knew she was no longer a guest. She was the storm. Chapter 22. The Goddess of the Obsidian Storm. The valley floor was a churning sea of shadows and steel as the rogue faction surged against the fortress gates. Because the enemy believed Kael was a hallowed king, they charged with a reckless, disorganized hunger, their violet-eyed leaders screaming for the weapon to be delivered. Seraphina stood at the vanguard of the Obsidian warriors, her heart beating in a rhythm that was no longer frantic, but focused. She didn't look back at the safety of the walls. She looked forward into the center of the chaos where the silver-haired leader's successor stood, a man who thought he could harvest her soul like grain. Now, Seraphina whispered, and the word rippled through the air like a physical shockwave. She didn't wait for Kael's command. She moved with a grace that transcended the physical. As she stepped into the fray, the silver light didn't explode in a violent, uncontrollable burst. Instead, it flowed from her fingertips like liquid moonlight, weaving around her allies to form a protective shimmer and striking her enemies with the precision of a needle. She was the conductor of a symphony of light and ash. Because she finally believed she was not poison, the power responded to her will rather than her fear. She wasn't destroying the world. She was purging the rot from it. Kael fought at her side, his blade a blur of obsidian steel. He was no longer the dominant alpha demanding her submission. He was her partner, her shadow, the anchor that allowed her to drift so far into the divine without losing her way. Every time a rogue lunged for her, Kael was there to intercept, his gray eyes burning with a new self-forged fire. They moved in a lethal, beautiful synchronicity that didn't need a magical bond to function. They were two souls choosing the same path in the dark, and that choice was more powerful than any ancient decree. The rogue leader lunged at Seraphina, his eyes glowing with that sickly, artificial violet light. He raised a jagged staff designed to siphon lichen energy, but Seraphina didn't flinch. She reached out and caught the wood of the staff with her bare hand. The silver light in her blood surged, meeting the violet energy and simply erasing it. She looked the man in the eyes, her expression one of fierce, calm clarity. "I am not a weapon you can claim," she said, her voice echoing with the weight of her ancestors. "I am the woman who chooses who lives and who dies on this mountain." With a single pulse of her will, the staff shattered and the leader was thrown back into the darkness, his stolen power vanishing like smoke in a gale. Chapter 23. The Throat of the King. The battle died down as the remaining rogues fled into the frozen wilderness, their morale shattered by the display of a power they couldn't comprehend. The morning sun began to creep over the jagged peaks of the Obsidian territory, painting the blood-stained snow in hues of gold and rose. Seraphina stood in the center of the clearing, her breath coming in slow, even plumes of frost. The silver light had settled into a gentle hum beneath her skin, a part of her rather than a burden. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see the entire pack, warriors, healers, and omegas alike, watching her with a silence that was no longer rooted in fear. Kael walked toward her, his armor dented and his face smeared with grime. He stopped 3 paces away, his gaze searching hers. He didn't look for the bond. He looked for the woman. In front of his entire people, in front of the warriors who had doubted her and the rivals who had hunted her, the Alpha of the Obsidian Peak did something that made the very air go still. He dropped to one knee. He inclined his head, baring the vulnerable line of his throat to her. It was the ultimate gesture of submission and trust, a total inversion of the hierarchy that had nearly destroyed them both. "You saved us," Kael said, his voice carrying to the furthest edges of the crowd. "Not because you were destined to, but because you wanted to. My life, my pack, and my heart are yours. Not by fate, but by my own hand." Seraphina felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't the hot, shameful tears of the girl in the Silver Ridge dungeon. These were tears of healing, the final wash that cleared the soot from her soul. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder, urging him to rise. Because she was no longer hiding from her own worth, she didn't feel the need to shrink from his devotion. She was a Luna who had earned her crown through the fire, and as she looked at the man she had almost destroyed, she saw only a future they would build together. "Rise, Kael," she whispered, her voice steady and warm. "We don't kneel to each other, we stand together." He rose, his eyes finally flashing that brilliant, healthy gold she had missed so much. The pack erupted into a roar of approval, a sound that shook the very foundation of the mountain. The trauma of the rejection, the shadow of her mother's death, and the fear of her own blood were gone, replaced by the thrumming, vibrant reality of the present. Chapter 24. The New Equilibrium. The moon was a sliver of silver in the velvet sky as Seraphina and Kael stood on the highest balcony of the fortress, looking out over the peaceful valley. The political landscape had shifted. The Silver Ridge Pack had sent an envoy of apology, and the council had officially recognized Seraphina's lineage not as a threat, but as a sovereign power. Because they had survived the fracture, they were something new, a union that didn't rely on the whims of the moon, but on the strength of their own character. "Can you feel it?" Kael asked, his arm draped around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. Seraphina closed her eyes and reached inward. The void where the bond used to be wasn't empty anymore. It was being filled with something slower, deeper, and more resilient. It was a connection built on shared meals, whispered secrets, and the memory of the way he had fought for her when he had no reason to. "I feel you," she murmured, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And I feel myself. For the first time, Kael, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." The ancient power within her was quiet, a sleeping dragon that she now knew how to wake and how to soothe. She was no longer a ghost or a ruin. She was a woman who had been publicly rejected and had found the courage to believe she was chosen anyway. She reached up and traced the line of Kael's jaw, her touch lingering with a soft, passionate intensity. The heat between them was no longer a detonation. It was a hearth, a steady fire that would keep them warm through the long winters to come. "I choose you back, Kael Draven," she said, her voice a promise that echoed into the night. "Every day, every hour, until there are no more mountains to climb." He kissed her then, a deep, lingering seal of their new life. The bond didn't snap back into place with a flash of magic. It grew back one thread at a time, woven by their hands rather than by fate. As they stood together under the watchful eye of the moon, Seraphina realized that love wasn't the danger she had feared. Fear was the poison, and love was the only thing that could survive the cure. She was the Luna of the Obsidian Peak, chosen not by blood, but by a heart that finally knew it was worthy of being kept.